The last thing Marcus Cole remembered about his son was the weight of the boy's hand in his, small fingers, bitten nails, a faint smell of cut grass, before the light came down and took him. That was the memory he carried for 3 years through whatever place the Veth called home. Not the debriefings that followed his return, not the alien geometries or the cold surgical procedures or the sound the Veth made when they communicated, a frequency that existed somewhere between a scream and a song. Not even the moment he understood, with a clarity that felt like a blade slipping between ribs, that they had done something to him that could not be undone. The hand, the grass smell, the boy saying, "Dad, watch this," just before the sky opened. That was the one he held on to. His name before the abduction was Marcus Cole, 38 years old. Former agricultural engineer, turned hobby farmer, turned briefly, in the weeks before the Veth came, a man trying very hard to remember how to be a father. His son Eli was 9 then. Bright too quiet, the kind of kid who collected things, stones with interesting shapes, dead beetles still perfect in their carapaces, scraps of metal he found along the fence line and lined up on his windowsill in an order only he understood. Rachel, Marcus's wife, said Eli got the collecting from him. Marcus had thought she meant it as a criticism. He hadn't been sure. He was sure now. The farm was 30 kilometers outside Harwich, and on the night Marcus disappeared, the sky above the east field had opened like a wound. Not dramatic, not slow and theatrical the way it looks in films, but sudden, a rip in the fabric of a Tuesday evening, and the light had been so total that Marcus had felt it in his teeth before he saw it with his eyes. He'd been standing by the old combine shed. Eli had been 20 meters away, playing some game that involved throwing a stone at a fence post. Eli had seen it too. That was the part that broke Marcus later, when he finally had the capacity to think about it, that his son had watched him go, had stood there in the east field with the light dying around him, and his father simply gone, and had been 9 years old. 3 years. The Veth did not keep time the way humans did, which meant Marcus arrived back on Earth with no reliable sense of duration. He knew it had been a long time because of the way his body had changed, not visibly. The Veth were precise about surfaces, but internally, in ways he felt as a constant low-grade wrongness, like a sound only he could hear. He knew it had been long enough for Rachel to move to London, long enough for Eli to be 12, long enough for the world to have filed Marcus Cole as a missing person and quietly moved on. He knew all this because they had given him his memories back, but not cleanly. They'd returned them the way you'd return a borrowed book, dog-eared, with notes in the margins, some pages stuck together. Whole weeks from before the abduction had a different texture now, as if the Veth had handled them too much, left their fingerprints on the emotional surface. He'd find himself reaching for a specific recollection, a meal, a conversation, the sound of Rachel's voice on their second anniversary, and find it there but flattened, the warmth leached out of it. Only the recent memories held their heat. Only the things the Veth couldn't have touched because they hadn't happened yet. The moment he understood he was going back, the moment the light opened from the other direction and deposited him on a roadside in rural Essex, wearing someone else's shirt, he'd walked 4 miles to the nearest village and used a phone box to call the police. The conversation had been brief and surreal. He'd given his name, his date of birth, his last known address. The officer on the other end had gone very quiet and then said, in the careful voice of someone managing an unusual situation, "Mr. Cole, there's a missing persons file. Can you tell me where you are right now?" He'd given the coordinates. He'd sat down on the curb outside the phone box and waited for them to come, and in the 40 minutes he sat there, he watched a sparrow dismantle a piece of bread on the pavement opposite, working at it with complete methodical focus, and thought that this was the most purely human thing he'd seen in 3 years, and it was almost too much to look at directly. The police had been respectful. The doctors had been thorough. The government liaison, who came later, who did not give his real name, had been practiced in a way that told Marcus this was not the first time, not by a long way. That was its own kind of information. "We have a protocol," the liaison had said, in a clean government office with no windows, "for people in your situation." "And how many people are in my situation?" Marcus had asked. The liaison had looked at him for a moment without speaking, which was itself an answer. "You said protocol," Marcus said. "What does that mean?" "Exactly. Monitoring, support. A cover story that explains your absence without..." The liaison had chosen his words carefully, without complicating the public understanding of the current geopolitical situation. "The geopolitical situation," Marcus repeated. "We prefer not to cause unnecessary alarm." Marcus had sat with that for a moment. "And if I prefer to find my son," a pause, "there's no legal obstruction to that. But you'd prefer I didn't." "We'd prefer," the liaison said, "that you gave yourself some time to stabilize before you re-enter family life. before you have contact with your child. There was something very specific under those words, Marcus thought. Something the liaison knew or suspected about what the Veth had done to him. Something that had been established in the 3 years of the protocol, the accumulated data from whatever other cases had come before. The liaison was not hostile, he was afraid. The carefully maintained professional distance was a kind of fear management. Marcus had looked at him across the clean desk and said, "I'm going to find my son. I'd rather do it with your help, but I'll do it without." He'd walked out of the building and hailed a cab. The liaison had not sent anyone after him. Marcus suspected this was because they were already watching. The city caught him off guard. He'd grown up near it, knew its rhythms, but 3 years away from human noise left him raw-nerved and flinching. The tube was the worst, the press of bodies, the heat, the underground percussion of it. And he stood on the platform at Liverpool Street for 7 minutes before he could make himself get on a train. He found Rachel's building through the address he had memorized before the Veth took him, some old emergency note she'd written for a neighbor. He stood across the street from it for a while, watching the windows. A light was on in the 3rd floor. He watched it the way he used to watch the horizon on the farm, reading something into the quality of it that probably wasn't there. There was a man at the window. Late 30s, American accent when he opened the door a minute later, after Marcus had crossed the street and pressed the buzzer. Stocky, clean-shaven, the particular look of a man who had made himself comfortable in someone else's space and didn't realize it showed. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Rachel. My name's Marcus Cole." A pause. A very specific kind of pause, the kind that lasts long enough to become a full sentence of its own. Then the man said, "Wait here," and went back inside. Rachel was not what Marcus had expected, which was foolish, because what he'd expected was the Rachel from 3 years ago, and time did not pause while you were gone. She was thinner, her hair was shorter. She held herself differently at the door, arms crossed not in hostility but in a kind of self-containment he recognized from the months before the abduction, when their marriage had been quiet in the wrong ways. She looked at him the way you look at a thing you'd given up for lost, cautious, not quite believing, some part of you already building a defense against the possibility that it isn't real. "Marcus." "Hi," she stopped. Looked at his hands, his face, something she was trying to read. "You look the same." "I know. That's not, I didn't mean, I know what you meant." They stood there in the doorway. Downstairs, someone was frying something with garlic. The American, his name, Marcus would learn, was David, had retreated to the kitchen and was making enough noise to be clearly audible without being physically present, which was a neat trick and Marcus gave him credit for it. "Eli's here?" Marcus asked. Something complicated moved across Rachel's face. "Yes." "Can I?" "Yes." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." Eli was sitting on his bed with his shoes on, which meant he'd heard the buzzer and put them on in case. He was 12 now, which was barely any time at all, and also a vast, irreversible amount. And Marcus stood in the doorway of his bedroom for a moment, just cataloging the changes. The height, the jaw losing its softness, the particular careful stillness the boy went into when he was working out whether something was safe. On the windowsill, 3 stones, a fragment of circuit board with a copper trace still intact, 2 small bolts, the kind used in agricultural machinery. Some things didn't change. "Dad." "Hey, bud." Eli looked at him for a long time, not accusatory, not tearful. Measuring, which was worse in some ways because it meant the boy had had 3 years to build walls and didn't know yet whether to take them down. Then he said, "I knew you were coming back. Mum didn't believe me." "I know," Marcus said, though he didn't know how he knew. "I know you did." He sat on the edge of the bed. Eli didn't move toward him or away from him, just sat there in that considering way. Then he said, "Were they? Did they hurt you?" "No," Marcus said, which was approximately true. "Not the way you mean. What did they want?" Marcus looked at his son's face, at the eyes that were Rachel's but the jaw that was his own, and thought about all the honest answers to that question, and then said, "I'm not sure yet, but I'm back now. That's what matters." Eli looked at him a moment longer. Then he said, "Okay," and leaned against his shoulder, and Marcus put his arm around the boy and sat very still because he didn't trust himself to move. The wrongness got worse at night. He'd told himself on the journey back that it would fade once he was home, that whatever the Veth had altered would settle, that the human environment would counteract the alien one the way a warm room counteracts cold. That was not what happened. What happened instead was that the wrongness, sharpened in the dark and the quiet, became specific rather than general, a set of instructions his body kept receiving that his conscious mind could not quite intercept. He slept in the spare room, a narrow bed with a duvet that smelled of someone else's washing powder, and in the hours between 2 and 5, he lay on his back and felt the alterations in himself with a precision that should have been terrifying, and quite, because the Veth had also done something to his fear response. Recalibrated it, maybe, or redirected it. He wasn't afraid of himself. He was afraid for Eli. There were things the Veth had given him along with the changes. Not consciously, not as a gift. The Veth did not give gifts. They made investments, but as residue, the way a coat holds the smell of the place it was worn. He could feel things that weren't visible. Pressure differentials, electromagnetic traces, living systems, their heat signatures as distinct to him now as fingerprints. He could feel Rachel sleeping in the next room. He could feel David's irritated wakefulness beyond the wall. He could feel Eli, and that signal was different, brighter, carrying something in it that made the Veth residue in Marcus's own body resonate like a struck tuning fork. He lay still for a long time processing that. Then he got up, went to Eli's room, and stood in the doorway watching the boy sleep. Eli was on his back, arms at his sides, utterly still. The stones on the windowsill caught the streetlight, the circuit board fragment, the two small bolts. Marcus watched him for 7 minutes, then went back to bed. David's name was David Marsh. He was, as the accent suggested, American, from Ohio originally, now a contractor working London infrastructure projects. He had moved in 8 months ago. Marcus figured this out not from anything anyone said, but from the specific way David occupied the flat. The way he avoided certain spaces that weren't quite his yet. The way he stood in the kitchen with the particular over-casualness of a man who wasn't sure whether he was allowed to make himself at home. Marcus did not dislike him. That would have been easier. What he felt instead was a kind of flat, clear-eyed recognition that David was doing his best in a situation nobody had planned for, and that his presence here was evidence of 3 years of Rachel's life that Marcus had missed and could not retrieve. It was not David's fault. It was not anyone's fault. The Veth had not asked permission. They were careful around each other, he and David, in the way of two people who understood the topology of the situation and were both, for different reasons, choosing not to name it. "You working?" David asked one morning over coffee, a week into Marcus's return, looking into it. "What's your field?" "Agricultural engineering." "Not a lot of call for it in London." David nodded. "Farming's in your blood then." "Something's in my blood," Marcus said. And David looked at him oddly and went to top up his coffee. Eli, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal he wasn't eating, caught Marcus's eye and almost smiled. There were things Marcus didn't do in those first weeks that he was becoming very aware of not doing. He didn't eat normally. He picked at food, moved it around, occasionally consumed enough to keep Rachel from asking questions, but his body had stopped processing human nutrition with any real enthusiasm. What it wanted instead was things he wouldn't name, couldn't name yet, and he fed it what he could and ignored the dissatisfaction in the way you ignore a persistent ache when there's nothing to be done about it. He didn't sleep through the night. Never more than 90 minutes at a stretch, and after each interval he lay awake with new information. Not thoughts exactly, more like data, the slow processing of his altered systems running their diagnostics. He began to understand that the Veth had not simply modified him. They had added to him, layered something onto the existing architecture of his body and mind, the way you might upgrade hardware, and the new components were still settling in, still finding their configurations. He didn't call old friends. There had been 2 or 3 close ones before. He'd thought about contacting them, had composed the conversations in his head. "I know it's been 3 years. Here's what happened. Here's what I am now." And each time had stopped before he got to the actual calling, because he wasn't sure he could hold the conversation together, was not sure his voice would stay level, was not sure he wouldn't say something that would require explanation he didn't have the words for yet. What he did instead was spend time with Eli. Not loudly, they weren't that kind of father and son, had never been, and 3 years of separation didn't magically install a warmth they'd been building slowly before the abduction. But Eli would come home from school and Marcus would be in the kitchen, or Eli would be doing homework at the table, and Marcus would sit at the other end with a book he wasn't really reading, and there was something in the simple shared occupation of a space that was good for both of them. Eli would occasionally slide something across the table, a question about something he was studying, a news article he'd found interesting, once a photograph he'd taken of a bird on the fire escape, and Marcus would respond, and they'd talk for a while, and it wasn't the grand reconstruction of a lost relationship, but it was solid, it was real, it was theirs. One evening, Marcus noticed that the stones on Eli's windowsill had rearranged themselves. He'd memorized their positions in the first week. Force of habit, his brain cataloging the room automatically. They'd been in a loose arc, largest to smallest. Now they were in a precise grid, equal spacing. Eli was sitting on his bed with headphones in, not looking at the windowsill. The window was closed. There was no obvious explanation for the rearrangement. Marcus stood in the doorway and looked at the stones for a long time. Then he went to his room and sat on the edge of his bed and thought about the signal he'd been feeling from Eli at night. The resonance, the frequency that matched something in himself. He thought about what the Veth had done and about inheritance and about what it meant to pass something on. He started paying attention to the stones. This was the method. Every morning before Eli woke up, Marcus checked the windowsill. He memorized the configuration. He came back in the evening and noted any changes. He did not touch them. He said nothing. Over 10 days, the pattern became clear. The stones moved when Eli was stressed, not consciously. Not by Eli's hand, Marcus had established that, but as a direct expression of whatever was building in the boy, the same way you clench a fist without knowing. When Eli had a bad day at school, the particular kind of bad day a 12-year-old doesn't talk about but brings home in his shoulders, the stones were disordered, scattered toward the edges of the sill. When Eli was calm, working through something, they drew together in ordered patterns, geometries that had no obvious meaning but felt intentional, felt designed. And there was the other thing, the dead beetle. It had been on the sill for as long as Marcus had known the room, a large stag beetle, perfect, dried and rigid in its carapace, part of Eli's collection. On the 11th day, Marcus checked the windowsill and the beetle was gone. He found it later on Eli's desk, intact, its legs articulating slightly. It had moved, not been moved, moved. Marcus sat with that information for the better part of an afternoon. That evening, when Eli got back from school, Marcus was in the kitchen as usual. Eli sat down, pulled out his maths homework. They were quiet for a while, just the scratch of pencil on paper and the ambient noise of the building, the TV in the flat above, the distant thrum of London. Then Marcus said, without preamble, "The stone's on your windowsill." Eli's pencil stopped. "You're not doing it on purpose," Marcus said. "I know that, but it's happening." Silence, and the beetle, Marcus said, a very long silence. "It scared me," Eli said finally, still not looking up from his homework. "When it started happening, I didn't tell Mum." "I know." "Did they?" He stopped, started again. "Did you bring something back with you, like a virus or something? Did they make it so you could?" "I think so," Marcus said. "Yes, something like that." "And it went into me?" "Yes, without I didn't choose that." "No," Marcus said, "you didn't, I'm sorry." A silence different from the others, not cautious, not measuring, but genuinely processing. Eli turned his pencil over in his fingers, end to end, a small mechanical rhythm while his mind worked. "Can I make it stop?" he asked. "I don't think so. I've tried. Have you wanted to? Stop it, I mean." Marcus thought about that, honestly. "At first," he said, "the first few weeks. Then I started to understand what it was, and no, not anymore." Eli looked up. "Why not?" "Because it's ours now. It was theirs, and we've made it ours. That's the only thing I know for certain about what happened to us." Eli looked at him for a long time with that 12-year-old measuring look. The one Marcus was beginning to understand was not suspicion, but the most serious form of attention the boy possessed, the look he gave to things that mattered. Then he said, "Show me how it works." Marcus looked at his son, looked at the stones on the windowsill, and the bolt with the copper trace circuit board, and the careful, ordered arrangement of things that a boy had spent 3 years building into a private cosmology on a windowsill in a London flat, waiting for a father who was supposed to be dead. He said, "Okay." What followed was not dramatic. What followed was careful, incremental, conducted in the hours between Eli's school day and Rachel's return from work, in the quiet flat with the TV turned low and the door to the hallway closed. Marcus taught his son the geometry of it. Not in those words. Eli was 12, and this needed to be navigable, but that was the substance of what was being transmitted. The spatial sense of the thing, the way the new faculty worked. It was not telekinesis in the science fiction sense, not the dramatic throw of objects across rooms. It was subtler, and in some ways stranger, the ability to feel the structural integrity of a thing, its internal tensions and tolerances, and then to alter those tensions in very small, precise ways. It was the difference between throwing a stone and understanding exactly how it would fall. Marcus began with the bolt. He picked it up from the windowsill, held it flat on his own palm, and then, slowly, demonstrating each step, extended his perception into it, mapped the iron and carbon distribution in its steel, found the electromagnetic signature that all ferrous metals carry and that the Veth sense in him read as clearly as a color. "Feel that," he said. Eli leaned forward slightly. Maybe, something. Don't try to hear it, feel it. Like when you're walking in the dark and you know a wall is coming before you touch it. A pause. Eli's face went through several expressions in quick succession. The specific cascade of a person whose brain is reorganizing itself around a new category of input. Then he said very quietly, "Oh yes," Marcus said. It was a natural, terrifyingly so. What had taken Marcus 3 weeks to map it himself, Eli understood intuitively in 3 days, as if the inherited version had come already calibrated. By the end of the first week, he could hold the stones in stable configuration, without thinking about it, the way you hold your balance without thinking. By the end of the second week, he could do it with his eyes closed. Marcus watched this with a feeling he couldn't fully name. Not pride. Pride felt too simple, too clean for what this was. Something more complicated, wound through with the specific grief of a parent who has given a child something they didn't ask for and can't take back, and who has to live with the ambiguity of whether that was a harm or a gift. Eli had not chosen this, but the things Eli did with it, the precision, the patience, the characteristic collecting impulse translated into a new medium, those were entirely his. Don't show anyone, Marcus said. I know. Not Mom. Not yet. Eli gave him a look that was already, at 12, a masterclass in not quite saying something. Then he said, she'll find out eventually. Yes, but not yet. Why not yet? Marcus picked up one of the stones from the windowsill, turned it in his fingers. Because I need to understand more about what we're dealing with before we bring more people into it, he said. The people who, the Veth, the ones who took me, they didn't do this by accident. None of what they did was accidental. And I don't know yet what they want to happen next. You think they're watching? I think they're aware. Eli sat with that. Then he picked up the bolt from the windowsill, the larger one, 12 millimeters, the kind used in the joint assembly on a cultivator, and turned it slowly in the air between them, no hands. A perfect steady rotation, and said, then let them watch. Marcus looked at his son's face and felt something that was not pride, exactly. Or not only pride, something fiercer and more complicated, with grief threaded through it, and a kind of awe that this was what you got, in the end. You went out into the dark and came back changed. And it turned out the change was inheritable. And the thing you passed on was not damage, but capability. He said good and meant it all the way down. There was also the matter of Marcus's own continued transformation. He had assumed, early on, that the changes were static, that what the Veth had installed was a fixed package, a finite set of alterations to his biology and sensory apparatus. What he discovered over the weeks in London was that it was more like a seed than a blueprint. The initial installation was the beginning. What grew from it depended on the environment, on use, on the specific pressures applied. He was becoming more himself, not less. That was the thing he hadn't anticipated, and it was the most important thing. The Veth had modified him, expecting to produce a version of Marcus Cole that was theirs, that worked toward their purposes, that was an instrument in their long, patient project of seeding their biology across species. What they had not modeled was that a human being, given enhanced perception and a finer sense of the structural reality underneath ordinary life, will immediately begin using those tools to understand and navigate the specific human world they live in. He was a better engineer. Not in the professional sense, he hadn't gone back to work yet, but in the fundamental sense, in the way he perceived problems and solutions. The Veth sense showed him the load-bearing elements in any structure, biological or mechanical or social. He could feel where the stress was. He could feel where the connection was strong and where it was fraying. He could feel with increasing clarity that the connection between Rachel and David was strong in some places and uncertain in others. Not because of him, or not entirely, but because it had been built under extraordinary pressure and was now being tested by the different pressure of normality of a situation that was the opposite of an emergency. He could feel the places where Rachel still held herself at a distance from her own life, still half expecting the ground to shift again. He could feel with the same clarity that this was not his to repair, that he had removed himself from Rachel's life in the most absolute way possible, had been removed involuntarily, but the effect was the same, and that whatever she'd built in his absence was hers, was real, was the evidence of 3 years of her living through something that would have broken a less determined person. He did not want her back. He wanted to be clear with himself about this, and was. What he wanted, what he had increasingly, was what he wanted was to be in the same city as his son, to be known by the boy, to be, in whatever form the situation allowed, a father. He thought sometimes about what kind of man he'd been before the Veth took him. The marriage had been struggling. He'd known it, had been managing it with the same anxious competence he applied to everything, cataloging the problems, generating solutions, never quite addressing the central thing, which was that he had been spending most of his emotional energy on the farm and the work, and almost none of it on the people who needed it. Eli had been 9 and largely raising himself in the quiet way of children, whose parents are physically present but emotionally elsewhere. The Veth had not fixed any of that. They had simply removed him entirely for 3 years, and return had forced the question that avoidance had been managing, What do you do with the time you have? He stayed. That was the answer he kept arriving at. He stayed in London, in the uncomfortable geography of a flat that wasn't his, and a family that had reorganized itself around his absence. He stayed through David's wariness and Rachel's careful neutrality and the slow work of re-establishing himself in Eli's life without demanding anything of it. He stayed through the government liaison's second and third attempts to contact him, which he ignored. He stayed through the nights when the Veth residue in him was loudest, when the alterations ran their diagnostics and the fear response they'd recalibrated came back online enough to remind him what was at stake. And in the staying, things clarified. The signal that the Veth were coming was not what Marcus expected. He'd thought it would be fear. He'd been carrying the anticipation of their return like a stone in his chest for weeks. Ever since the night he'd checked on Eli and felt that resonance, that frequency match, the Veth sense in him recognizing a signal in his son and understanding that the interest was not over, not by a long way. He'd thought when the signal came it would arrive as dread. Instead, it arrived as a smell. He was in the kitchen on a gray Thursday morning, standing at the counter with a cup of tea he wasn't drinking, when the smell hit him. Ozone and something under it, the specific electromagnetic signature the Veth emitted when they were close and active. It registered in his altered olfactory system like a fire alarm, precise and unmistakable. He set down his cup carefully. The streetlight outside the window was flickering at irregular intervals. A neighbor's dog had started barking and then, suddenly, stopped. Eli was at school, Rachel was at work, David was on a site visit, Marcus was alone. He went to the window. The street below was ordinary. A few parked cars, a woman pushing a buggy, the usual Thursday morning choreography. Nothing visible. But the smell was stronger now, directional, and he tracked it with the new sense the Veth had given him, the way you track a sound, turning, orienting, finding the source. The source was above. He looked up. The cloud cover was low and gray. Nothing in it, nothing he could see. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize, a set of coordinates, 40 characters of alphanumeric string that should have been meaningless, and wasn't, because the Veth sense in him decoded it the way a native speaker reads a word they've always known. The coordinates resolved to a location 90 minutes east of London by car, an industrial estate in the flatlands near the coast. He stood there with the phone in his hand for a moment, aware of what this was. A summons, deliberate, patient, and aware also of what it meant that they'd sent it to him and not simply appeared. They were being careful, which meant they thought he might run, which meant they didn't fully understand what had changed. He drove out to the coast on a motorcycle he'd borrowed from a neighbor without asking, moving through the gray morning with the ozone smell growing stronger as he went. The industrial estate was the kind of place that exists in the forgotten margins of Britain. 4 or 5 warehouse units on a gravel flat, surrounded by scrubland and pylons and the distant shimmer of the North Sea. Half the units were shuttered. One had a light on. He parked 100 meters out and approached on foot. The unit had no obvious sign, no company name, no vehicles outside. The door was standing open, not ajar, not unlocked, but open, a deliberate invitation. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his senses map the interior, and what they found was not what he'd prepared himself for. There were 2 of them. He'd never seen a Veth in good light before. During the abduction and the 3 years that followed, his memories of their appearance were filtered through the particular compression of extreme experience. Bright patches, impressions, the body's recording of things it couldn't fully process. He'd known they were large, bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical enough to read as vaguely humanoid at a distance. In the fluorescent wash of the warehouse, he saw them clearly for the first time and understood that the humanoid quality was precise, intentional, a configuration they'd arrived at rather than a natural form, the way a tool is shaped to fit the hand that uses it. They were approximately 2 meters tall. Their skin, if that was the word, had the texture and reflectivity of wet slate, a blue-gray that caught the light in bands. 4-fingered hands with an additional digit on the inside of each wrist, a secondary thumb that folded back when not in use. Their faces were where the bilateral symmetry loosened. The eyes were 3, arranged vertically in the center of the face rather than paired, and what served as a mouth was a horizontal slit that moved when they communicated, though the sound that emerged was mostly outside the range of ordinary human hearing. Marcus caught the subsonic edge of it, felt it in his chest. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that one of them had been present during his abduction. He could feel the signature, the specific electromagnetic resonance that identified a Veth individual the way a fingerprint identifies a human. The other was new. "Marcus Cole," said the familiar one. The voice was approximate, not quite right. The tonal range of human speech hit at odd harmonics, as if the mouth had been constructed for the phonemes but not the music underneath them. They'd gotten better at it, though. 3 years ago, they'd barely managed his name. "You found me," he said. "You are not difficult to find. You carry our mark. I know. We have come for the boy." There was no warmth in the way they said it. No cruelty either. The Veth Marcus had learned operate entirely outside of warmth and cruelty. Those were human categories, temperatures on a scale that ran between two poles only humans found significant. The Veth were purely purposive. They had an objective. The boy was the objective. "No," Marcus said. A pause. The secondary Veth moved slightly. A small adjustment of weight, a recalibration. The familiar one's triple eyes tracked Marcus with the steady attention of something that has never needed to blink. "The process has begun," it said. "The inheritance is established. This is not a negotiation." "I know what you think it is," Marcus said. "I spent 3 years watching you think. You don't negotiate because you don't expect resistance. Every species you've done this to has either complied or collapsed." He took Espen to the warehouse. "You've never tried it on us before. You are not as different as you believe." "No," Marcus agreed. "We're probably not. But we're different enough." He had prepared for this conversation, had been preparing for it in some part of himself since the first night he stood in Eli's doorway and felt that resonant frequency. He had rehearsed the arguments. He knew what the Veth would say and what he would say back. He knew that none of it would matter, that the Veth did not respond to arguments, that they responded to capability and incapability, and nothing in between. So he had prepared for that too. "You modified me to carry a specific signal," he said, "to transmit it. You planned for the inheritance to pass through me to Eli, and for Eli's enhanced biology to operate the same way mine does, as a relay, a beacon, something you could track and find and retrieve when you were ready." "Yes," said the familiar Veth, "not a concession, a confirmation. What you didn't plan for is that I've spent 6 weeks not relaying the signal. I've been filtering it, redirecting it. Everything you gave me to make me useful to you, I've been repurposing." He looked directly at the 3 vertical eyes. "That's what we do. That's the thing you keep not understanding about us. You give us something and we make it ours." A silence. The subsonic communication between the 2 Veth was happening. He could feel the edge of it, the compressed data exchange, and what he felt in it was something that might, in a human, have been recalibration, reassessment. "You cannot undo what has been done," the familiar Veth said. "I know. I'm not trying to undo it, I'm using it." What followed was not a fight in any conventional sense. The Veth were not built for physical confrontation. They were built for biology, for the patient work of alteration and inheritance, for the architecture of other species' transformation. They were confident in their capability, because in their experience capability was the end of the conversation. A species either had the tools to resist or it didn't, and the tools they'd given Marcus were their tools, which they thought they understood. What they hadn't accounted for was what Marcus had been doing with those tools for 3 years. Before they returned, he had been repurposing them. The Veth sense, the electromagnetic perception, the structural analysis, the ability to interface with living systems, had been given to him as a monitoring device, a way of tracking Eli's development and reporting back to them without their needing to be present. What Marcus had done instead, in the long sleepless nights and the careful mornings, was map it, had understood it from the inside, had found its parameters, had worked out that the same sense that could read a living system could, with the right application of the modifications the Veth had made to his own biology, interfere with one. He couldn't hurt them physically. He was honest with himself about that. He was one human, and they were 2 Veth, and even with what he'd become, that arithmetic was brutal. What he could do was disrupt. The Veth communicated and coordinated through a subsonic field, a kind of constant low-level signal that moved between them, sharing processing load, sharing sensory data. It was extraordinarily efficient. It was also, Marcus had established, susceptible to interference from within, from something that understood its frequency, because it had been made from the same template. He threw himself at the familiar Veth. Not in attack, that was the cover, the misdirection, the thing they expected from a cornered human. He was close enough to touch when he activated the interference, broadcasting on the Veth's own frequency at maximum amplitude, and the effect was what he'd calculated. The communication channel between the 2 of them collapsed, and in the moment of disorientation that followed, the careful, purposive certainty that was the Veth's greatest weapon became noise. It lasted 4 seconds, possibly 5, long enough for Marcus to be at the door. He ran. He drove the motorcycle flat out back toward London and called Rachel from a roadside lay-by, the wind still loud in his ears, his hands steadier than they should have been. "I need you to get Eli out of school," he said. "Right now. Don't explain, just go." Marcus, what is? They're here, the ones who took me. They want Eli. He heard her breath catch. That specific sound of a person receiving information they'd been quietly dreading for a long time. I've bought us time. Not much. A silence. Then Rachel said, where do we go? The farm, our old farm. I know why, she said, and her voice had something in it he recognized. The particular hardness of a person who had spent 3 years preparing for the thing that was now happening even when they'd told themselves they weren't. I'll get him. Go there. We'll meet you. She hung up. Marcus held the phone for a moment, staring at the flat gray line of the horizon. He thought about David. He called back, got voicemail, left a message that was brief and honest and would probably sound insane. Then he got back on the motorcycle, the farm. He arrived 20 minutes ahead of Rachel and Eli, which gave him time to walk the east field. The field where it had happened, where the light had come down 3 years ago on a Tuesday evening with the smell of cut grass in the air. The grass was still there, unmown, grown long and seeding in the November wind. The combine shed was still there, door rusted open. The fence post Eli had been throwing stones at was still there, still wearing the dent. He stood in the middle of the field and turned slowly, mapping it with the Veth sense, reading its electromagnetic geography. The Veth had a preference for locations they'd used before, something about the residual signature, the echo of a previous opening. This field was marked. It would be where they came. He was still turning when Eli's voice came from behind him. I know what you're doing. He turned. Eli was crossing the field from the road, backpack still on, school uniform. Rachel was a few steps behind, her coat open, hair wind-tangled. Eli's face was the same considering expression Marcus had seen in the doorway of the boy's bedroom on the night he came back. Measuring, assessing, deciding whether it was safe. I told Mum, Eli said, about the stones, the beetle, everything. Marcus looked at Rachel. I know, she said. Her voice was flat but not cold. Something in it that he thought might be a kind of terrible, resigned understanding. How long has this been happening? Since I came back. Maybe before, in a lesser way. The Veth, don't explain it to me right now, she said. Later. Right now, tell me what we do. He loved her for that. Had forgotten how much. We make it so the choice isn't theirs, he said. We make it so they can't take him without his consent, and he doesn't consent. He looked at Eli. That's the part they haven't considered. They think they're inheriting this from me, through him. They think he's a delivery mechanism. They don't understand that we've already changed what that means. Because of what you've been teaching me, Eli said. Yes. And we're different enough? What you said to them. We need to be, Marcus said. We're going to find out. They had perhaps 40 minutes. Marcus spent them in the field with Eli, and what happened in those 40 minutes was not what he'd planned. He'd thought of it as a transmission, a final urgent download of technique and awareness. But what actually happened was different. What happened was that Eli, who had already absorbed the technique faster and more thoroughly than Marcus had expected, simply sat down in the middle of the field and started working. Not dramatically, not with visible effort. He sat cross-legged in the long grass with his eyes closed and his hands in his lap, and Marcus, standing over him, felt the field come alive. The electromagnetic signature of the place, already marked by the Veth's previous visit, already carrying that residual resonance, began to change. Eli was doing what Marcus had described theoretically as retuning, altering the frequency of the residual signal, not erasing it but transforming it the way you transform a code by changing its key. If the Veth were tracking this location by its signature, they would still find it. But the signature they'd find would not be the one they'd left. It was extraordinary work. Marcus crouched beside his son and watched it happen, and felt the Veth sense in him tracking every adjustment with a kind of awe that was completely objective. This was technically extraordinary, better than he could have managed. Evidence of the inherited version working at a level of precision the original had never reached. Good, he said quietly. Eli didn't open his eyes. Tell me when they come. Rachel was standing at the edge of the field. She'd been watching them work, her arms crossed, her face very still. David had arrived 20 minutes in, pulling up in a hired car at a speed that suggested Rachel's voicemail had been more alarming than she'd intended. He was standing next to her now, not quite touching her, looking at the field with an expression of a man who had made a decision to be present and was holding to it. Marcus noted this, filed it. He stood up and went to stand with Rachel. He's 12, Rachel said, without looking at him. I know. This is, she stopped. Started again. I'm not angry with you. I want to be, but I know that's not. I know this isn't something you chose. No. But he chose to sit down in that field, she said. That's him. That's not whatever they gave you. That's him choosing. Yes. Marcus looked at their son. That's exactly him. She looked at him then, a full look, the kind that doesn't hold anything back, and said, Are you going to be okay? when this is over? I don't know. Are you still you? He thought about the answer he'd given Eli, most of me, the important parts. He thought about whether that was still true. He thought about the long nights and the Veth residue, and the things he could feel, now that he couldn't feel before, and whether any of that had changed the thing he was at the center. Yes, he said, I think so. I'm still the person who came back for him. She nodded slowly. Not agreement exactly, acknowledgement. Then the ozone smell hit them all at once, and the sky above the east field opened. They came through in the way Marcus remembered, the light first, total and sourceless, the kind that eliminates shadow rather than casting it. And then the structural geometry of the opening itself, a shear in the air that his Veth sense mapped as a massive displacement of electromagnetic field. And then the Veth themselves, 3 of them this time, the familiar one and the secondary from the warehouse, and a third Marcus hadn't encountered before, moving with the precise purposive confidence of entities that had done this 10,000 times on 10,000 worlds, and never once found a reason to hurry. They descended into the field, not flying exactly, more like the air held them differently than it held other things, and the familiar one's 3 eyes found Marcus immediately and then shifted to Eli, who was still sitting cross-legged in the grass, eyes still closed. You ran, said the familiar Veth. A fact, not a rebuke. Yes, this does not change the outcome. Let's find out, Marcus said. The familiar Veth oriented toward Eli, made a sound, subsonic the communication channel, and the 3 of them began to move. Eli opened his eyes. What happened next was not a single dramatic gesture. It was precision. It was the specific, concentrated application of 3 weeks of careful practice by a 12-year-old boy who had been doing what Eli always did, collecting, ordering, building a structure out of components that didn't obviously belong together. And the Veth walked into it the way you walk into a wall you haven't seen. The field's electromagnetic signature, which Eli had spent 40 minutes carefully retuning, was not what the Veth expected. The frequency they'd sent ahead of them, the signal that was meant to key their technology to the marked location, hit Eli's retuning and scattered. Their structural coordination, that subsonic communication channel that Marcus had disrupted for 4 seconds in the warehouse, began to fragment as the modified field interfered with it, not because Eli had copied Marcus's interference technique, but because he'd done something subtler. He'd made the field itself do the interference, ambient and constant, and coming from every direction at once. The 3 Veth stopped. Marcus felt the disruption in his own Veth sense, felt it as a kind of sympathetic static, the inherited signal in him responding to the field's altered frequency, and understood that Eli had, with extraordinary precision, tuned the interference so that it would affect the Veth, but not Marcus, had calibrated it to distinguish between the template and the inheritance, between what the Veth had put into his father and what his father had passed on. Same raw material, different design. The familiar Veth made a sound that was new, not communication, not purposive, but something with the character of recalculation, of a model being revised. Its 3 eyes moved from Eli to Marcus and back. You have modified the inheritance, it said. Yes, Marcus said. This was not the intended outcome. No, Marcus agreed. That's kind of the point. You understand that this is a pause unusual. The Veth were not creatures who paused. This is irreversible. What the child has done to this field, the modification of the inheritance signature, this closes a pathway. This endpoint is no longer accessible to us. I know. There will be others of your kind, others who carry the mark. Probably, Marcus said. And every one of them will be exactly like him. Specifically human, not what you planned. He took a step forward. That's what I'm telling you. That's the thing you got wrong about us. You can alter our biology, but you cannot alter what we do with the alteration. You give us a tool and we repurpose it. You give us a limitation and we find the edge of it. You gave my son something and he made it his own. That's not a bug in our design. That is the design. The familiar Veth was still. The other 2 behind it were still. The field hummed with Eli's work, steady and quiet, and the ozone smell was thinning, the light above them beginning to close. Humans, said the familiar Veth, and the word in its voice was not quite dismissal and not quite respect, but something that existed in the narrow space between them. Something that might, from a certain angle, look like recognition. Then they were gone. The light closed like a door. The field was quiet. November wind, distant sea, the ordinary sounds of a world that had no idea any of this had happened and was going to be fine, not knowing. Marcus stood in the long grass and felt the Veth sense in him settle for the first time since his return, the static clearing, the interference resolved. The mark they'd put on this place was gone. Eli's work had seen to that. He turned around. Eli was on his feet, brushing grass off his school trousers with the matter-of-fact air of someone who has just done something significant and is now processing the paperwork of returning to ordinary life. Rachel was crossing the field toward them at something faster than a walk. David was behind her, keeping a respectful distance, which Marcus thought showed a kind of intelligence. Rachel got to Eli first and held him for a long time without saying anything. Eli led her. He looked over her shoulder at his father with an expression that was tired and 12 years old and very calm. Marcus said quietly, "You good?" Eli said, "Yeah." "The bolt in your pocket?" Eli blinked, then reached into his jacket pocket and produced the 12-millimeter bolt from his windowsill collection. He hadn't even known he'd brought it. He looked at it for a moment, turned it over. "Habit," he said. "Good habit," Marcus said. They stayed at the farm that night, all four of them. In the house that had sat empty for 3 years with the lights out and the smell of disuse and a fine coat of dust on every surface. Marcus and David cleared the kitchen while Rachel got Eli settled, and they worked in an easy silence that had nothing of avoidance in it, just two people doing a useful thing. And at the end of it, David put down the cloth he'd been using and said, "I'm not going to pretend I understood everything that happened today." "No," Marcus agreed, "but I understand enough." He looked at Marcus directly, the first time he'd done that in the weeks since Marcus's return. "He's a good kid," Marcus said. "You did that. Rachel did that," Marcus said. "I was away for 3 years." David nodded slowly. "She never stopped thinking you were coming back," he said. "I want you to know that. I know the situation is complicated. But she never stopped." Marcus stood with that for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, yeah." David picked the cloth back up. "So, what happens now?" "We figure it out," Marcus said. "All of us, together." In the morning, Marcus found Eli in the east field. He was standing at the fence post, the old one dented from the stones, with his hands in his pockets and his breath misting in the cold air, looking at the space where the light had come down the first time and the second time, and now, with any luck, never again. He didn't hear Marcus approach until Marcus was beside him, and then he glanced sideways without surprise, as if he'd been expecting it. They stood there for a while. "Are they going to come back?" Eli said. "Not here. Not for you." Marcus thought about the familiar Veth's word, humans, and the specific quality of whatever had been in it. Maybe for someone else, somewhere else. "So we should warn people. Eventually, yes. Because they don't know what we can do yet." "Because they don't know what they can do," Marcus said. "The Veth's mark, whatever residue they've left behind in their other subjects, those people think they're compromised, think they're changed in a way that's only a loss. They don't know it can be something else." Eli considered this. "So you're going to find them." "We're going to find them." Eli looked at him. "You mean me too?" "I mean you too, when you're old enough, when you want to." Marcus turned to face his son. "This is not a draft, Eli. I'm not the Veth. I don't get to decide what you do with what I've passed on to you. That's yours." A long silence. The cold wind moved the long grass. "I want to," Eli said. "I already want to. I've been wanting to since the day you told me about the stones." He paused. "Is that weird that I'm not scared?" "No," Marcus said. "That's exactly right." Eli reached into his pocket and produced the bolt, held it flat on his palm for a moment, looking at it. Then, slowly, he raised it, still on his palm, level, perfectly still, and let it go. It stayed there, suspended, an inch above his palm, turning with the slow, precise rotation Marcus remembered from the kitchen table in London all those weeks ago that evening that felt like a beginning. "You know what Mum said last night?" Eli said, watching the bolt turn. "She said you're a collector, same as me, that you always were. What do you think about that?" Eli smiled, the first full smile Marcus had seen from him, the one that had been hiding behind the measuring expression all these weeks. "I think it's true," he said. "I think you went out there and you collected something and you brought it back and you gave it to me, and I made it mine." He looked at his father. "And now they can't have it back." Marcus watched his son, watched the bolt turning in mid-air in the cold November morning above the east field, over the grass and the dented fence post and the soil that had been marked and was now clean, and felt something in the deep structure of himself, in the specifically human part that the Veth had built around but could not touch, settle into place. "No," he said, "they can't." There were 17 of them eventually. It took 2 years to find them all. 17 human beings scattered across 6 countries who carried the Veth's mark, who had been returned to their lives, altered and bewildered, and managing what had been done to them with the full spectrum of human coping mechanisms. Denial, rage, quiet internal cataloging, elaborate self-medication, extraordinary acts of creative compensation. A retired school teacher in New Zealand who had spent 18 months thinking she was developing schizophrenia before she understood what she was. Actually developing was a sense of electromagnetic topology so precise she could map the fault lines under the South Island by walking in the rain. A crane operator in Gdansk who had been treating what he called his new hearing with whiskey since his return and would, once Marcus and Eli found him, discover that what he could hear was the Veth frequency, and that his particular interpretation of it was the most precise of any of them. A 23-year-old woman in Lagos who had known from the first week after her return that what she'd been given was a gift and had been using it, patiently and methodically, to grow crops in soil that should not have been able to sustain them. Each of them, Marcus found, had done what Eli had done, had taken the Veth's template and made it human. Not overwriting the alien in themselves, but layering over it something that was indelibly theirs, their history, their relationships, their specific and irreplaceable way of being in the world. None of them had been passive recipients. All of them, in their different ways, had repurposed. The schoolteacher from New Zealand said it best, when Marcus sat across from her in her kitchen with its view of the mountains and explained what he was building and why. She listened to everything, and then she said, "They made us into instruments. They didn't account for the musician." "That's it exactly," Marcus said. "Did they understand that? In the end?" He thought about the familiar Veth's voice, that final strange word, the quality in it he'd been trying to name for 2 years. Not dismissal, not respect. Something older than either of those, something that existed before the categories, surprise. The Veth, who had seeded 100 species across 100 worlds and had never once been surprised by the outcome, had been surprised. "I think they're starting to," he said. "I think for the first time in a very long time, they're genuinely uncertain about what we'll do next." The schoolteacher smiled. She was 71 years old, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something permanent and fine, and when she smiled, it changed the whole room. "Good," she said. "That's a good place to leave them." She got up to put the kettle on, and outside the window the mountains were clear, and the fault lines were quiet, and the sky above the South Island was nothing but sky. Ordinary, enormous, belonging to no one, available to anyone with the will to look up and keep looking. Marcus Cole sat in a stranger's kitchen in New Zealand and drank a cup of tea and watched his son, 1,200 kilometers away in London, practice a thing that the universe had intended for someone else's purpose, and felt the signal that connected them, that bright specific frequency, the inheritance modified and claimed and irreversibly human, hum in the new parts of himself like a song. He thought about a Tuesday evening on a farm, a boy throwing a stone at a fence post, small fingers, bitten nails, the smell of cut grass. He thought, "I came back." He thought, "We're just getting started." The crane operator's name was Tomasz Wyszynewski, and he lived in a second-floor flat above a hardware shop in Gdańsk that he'd owned for 31 years and had no intention of leaving. He was 54, built like a man whose work had been physical his whole life, with hands that were remarkable, broad, scarred at the knuckles, trembling slightly from the nerve damage that was one of several things the whiskey had been managing. He'd been returned 3 years ago, 8 months after Marcus's own return, and had told no one except his sister, who had told no one except her priest, who had told no one at all because what the sister had described was not anything the theology he'd been trained in had a clean category for. Marcus found him through the government liaison, who had, after 18 months of being ignored, apparently decided that cooperation was more useful than surveillance and had quietly provided a list. Not out of altruism, Marcus suspected. Out of the recognition that the alternative was to keep watching from the outside while something unprecedented developed on the inside, and that watching from the outside was increasingly a position with no practical value. The liaison's name was Christopher Hale, and he was 46, and had the specific exhaustion of a man who had been managing a secret for a long time without anyone to share the weight of it. "There are 17 confirmed returns," Hale had said on the phone, the first time Marcus had answered in 8 months, "that we know of. There are probably more. People don't always. The circumstances of return aren't always." He'd stopped, started again. "Some people come back in places where it's harder to document." "Harder to document," Marcus repeated. "Remote areas, unstable regions. People without reliable access to official systems. People the government doesn't track." A pause. "Yes, you've been watching all of them. We've been monitoring the ones we can find. And what have you concluded?" Another pause, longer. "That the modifications are consistent across subjects. That the modifications appear to be heritable in some cases, though the mechanism isn't." He'd stopped. "That none of the subjects appear to be a threat. That several of them appear to be doing remarkable things. And you're telling me this now because..." "Because," Hale said, choosing his words with the care of a man diffusing something, "we've had a contact. Not from the subjects, from the others. The Veth." A very long silence. "They want to negotiate," Hale said finally. "They've sent, I don't know what to call it, a representative, a message, a formal indication of intent. And they've specified, he stopped. They've specified that they want to negotiate with Marcus Cole. Marcus had looked at the wall of the New Zealand kitchen for a long moment. Send me the list, he said. All 17. I'll find them first. Then we'll talk about negotiating. Tomasz Wisniewski listened to Marcus's explanation over a table covered in technical drawings, crane, specifications, load calculations, the precise engineering language of a man who understood the exact tolerances of enormous suspended weight. He listened without interrupting, which Marcus had come to recognize as a specific kind of intelligence. Not passivity, but the discipline of a person who has learned that understanding requires silence. When Marcus finished, Thomas turned one of his large scarred hands over on the table and looked at it. The hearing, he said. I thought it was tinnitus. Then I thought it was something neurological. Then I found out it was that I could hear when something was wrong, in the cranes, before any instrument could measure it. Metal fatigue, bearing stress, the moment before a cable begins to fail. He paused. I've prevented 11 accidents in 3 years. I told myself I was just experienced. Getting better at reading the machines. You were, Marcus said, and more than that. And the whiskey. The whiskey was for the frequency you couldn't filter. The background Veth signal, the residual transmission. Alcohol disrupts electromagnetic sensitivity. It was working as a damper. Tomas looked at him. A damper, he said. You were self-medicating an alien modification with vodka, and it was medically coherent, Marcus said. I mean that seriously. You found the right tool, you just didn't know what you were using it for. A silence. Then Tomas laughed, a short, surprised sound, the laugh of a man who has not found much genuinely funny in a long time, and said, my sister's going to be very disappointed. She thought the drinking was a spiritual failure. Tell her it was applied physics. She'll prefer that, Tomas said. She's an engineer. They sat together for another 2 hours. Marcus walked him through the geometry, the same process he'd used with Eli, adapted for a man of 54 whose relationship to the modification was already 3 years old and deeply embedded in his professional practice. It was different work than it had been with Eli. The boy had been raw material, unhardened, open to new configurations. Thomas was a made thing, a person whose identity was already deeply settled, and the modification had grown into the shape of him rather than the other way around. What Marcus was doing was not teaching but translating, helping a man understand in explicit terms something he'd already been doing implicitly. At the end of it, Tomas set a pencil upright on the table between them, balanced on its point, and held it there without touching it for a full minute while they talked about something else. How many more? He asked, when Marcus stood to leave. 15 others, that we know of, and then the negotiation. Yes, Tomas stood also, extended his remarkable hand. Then let's not waste time, he said. The woman in Lagos was named Adize Obi, and she was the one Marcus had been most nervous about finding, not because of the distance, but because of what Hale had told him about her case. She had been returned not in a field or on a roadside, but in the middle of a market, in broad daylight, surrounded by 40 people. The light had come down in the middle of the day in front of witnesses and deposited her from 3 years of absence onto a street she'd been walking. On the morning she was taken, she'd been 19 when she was taken. She was 22 now, and 3 years of absence with a witnessed return had left her family's life in a specific kind of chaos that had very little to do with the Veth, and everything to do with how human communities respond to things they cannot explain. She had moved away from her neighborhood. She was living in a small house on the outskirts of the city, with a garden that was, by the time Marcus arrived, the most obviously extraordinary thing he had ever seen a modified human produce. It was not large, perhaps 30 meters by 20, but every square meter of it was producing food. Not normal production, the soil this close to the city was exhausted, compromised by decades of poor drainage and contamination, the kind of ground that would barely sustain weeds. A daisy's garden produced 10 varieties of vegetable in continuous rotation, the soil transformed by something Marcus's Veth sense read immediately as a sustained, deliberate electromagnetic intervention, the same structural modification that Eli used on metal and Tomas used on machines, applied to organic chemistry, to the molecular architecture of soil and root and mycorrhizal network. She was sitting in the garden when he arrived, hands in the soil, eyes closed, working. She heard him coming. He could feel her sensing him the way he sensed her, the mutual recognition of two people carrying the same mark, and looked up. I've been waiting, she said. Her English was precise, her voice very calm. Hale told you I was coming? No, I just knew. The same way I know when this patch needs water or when the nitrogen is low. She looked at her hands. I know where the marked ones are. I could feel you coming from about 50 kilometers. Marcus crouched beside her. You can sense the others? All of them, if I'm paying attention. It's like a sound that has a location. You know which direction it's coming from. She paused. I've always known where you were. London, mostly. Then New Zealand. Then Poland. She looked at him directly. Her eyes were very steady. I knew when you went to talk to the two of them in that building on the coast. I could feel it when you disrupted them. Marcus sat down in the garden, across from her, among the extraordinary soil. What did it feel like, he asked. She considered. Like a bell, she said. Like someone rung a very large bell, and for a moment everything stopped and listened. They were quiet for a moment. A bird Marcus didn't recognize landed on the fence post at the edge of the garden, regarded them, and left. The negotiation, Ade said. You know about that too. I know that it's coming. I don't know what we're negotiating for. She looked at him. What are we negotiating for? Marcus had been thinking about this since the phone call with Hale. Had been turning it in his mind the way Eli turned the bolt, examining it from every angle, looking for the weight distribution, the load-bearing point. Autonomy, he said. The right to keep what they gave us without being subject to what they intended it for. The right of our children, the ones who inherit this, to be ours, to be human, to grow up marked but not owned. And if they won't negotiate that, then we demonstrate that the alternative is worse for them. He paused. 17 of us, Adeze. 17 people, 6 countries, all with modifications that we've repurposed in ways they didn't anticipate. Every one of us doing something with this that they can't predict, can't map, can't recover from. Their whole strategy depends on predictability, on having a model for how a species responds to the mark. We've broken their model. They don't have a replacement. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, they're afraid of us. They're uncertain about us. For the Veth, I think that's worse. She smiled. It was a slow, careful smile, the kind that had thought behind it. When? She said. I need to find the other 14 first. I can help with that, she said, and put her hands back in the soil. The 14 others took 4 months to find and 3 more to sit with, to explain to walk through the same conversation Marcus had had with Tomas and Adeze, and before them Eli. You are not broken. You are not a victim. You are not a relay station or a delivery mechanism. You are a human being who has been altered by something alien, and who has made that alteration yours. You are the musician who was handed an instrument and who plays it differently than it was made to be played. Some of them wept. Some of them were angry, in the specific way of people who have been managing something alone for a long time and have only now been told they didn't have to. One of them, a former military officer from South Korea named Park Jisoo, who had been using her modification to map the neurological states of her patients in a way that had made her the most diagnostically accurate psychiatrist in Seoul, looked at Marcus across her desk and said very quietly, I've been telling myself for 3 years that what happened to me doesn't define me, that I'm still who I was. You are, Marcus said. And also something more. And also something more, he agreed. Both things are true. That's the specifically human thing about it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what are the Veth? It was a question everyone asked, eventually. And Marcus had been thinking about his answer to it for 2 years. Old, he said, very old. Older than any civilization we know about. They've been doing this, seeding modifications into species, harvesting the outcomes, for longer than our species has existed. Every world they've visited, every species they've marked, has become part of their network, their biology, their extended distributed system. He paused. What we are to them is a new node, a new component in something enormous and patient and fundamentally not interested in us as individuals. But they miscalculated. Every species before us has either been too different or not different enough, too alien to be useful, or too compliant to be interesting. We're in a particular band. We're similar enough to them biologically that the mark took cleanly, inherited cleanly, spreads cleanly. But we're stubborn in a way they haven't encountered before. We adapt. We repurpose. We take the thing that was supposed to make us theirs, and we make it ours. Park Jisoo looked at her hands. The elegant hands of a person who had been using alien-enhanced neurological perception to help human minds heal for 3 years. She turned them over. She looked at them for a long time. Then that's what we bring to the negotiation, she said. Not just that we won't comply, but that we can't be made to, that it's not in our nature. Yes, Marcus said. And they need to understand that's not a temporary condition, that our children will be the same. And their children, yes. We're not a failed experiment, she said. We're a different experiment. That's exactly what we're going to tell them. The negotiation happened on a Tuesday. Marcus had asked for that, had specified, through Hale, that it should be a Tuesday. No one had asked him why, which was fine. The why was personal, private. The particular stubbornness of a man who had lost a Tuesday 3 years ago and had decided that the best possible use of the day was to reclaim it for something. Hale had arranged a location in Scotland, a cleared government facility on the coast of the Firth of Forth. Low buildings on open ground, the water gray and cold in the November morning. All 17 of them had come. They stood in the forecourt in the early light. People from 6 countries and many more histories, and Marcus looked at them and felt the interconnected signals of their marks as a kind of quiet music. A Daisy's deep soil frequency from Lagos, Tamaz's crane operator precision from Gdańsk, Park Ji-soo's neurological clarity from Seoul, and the others, all the different shapes the same raw material had taken in 17 different human hands. Eli was there. Marcus had argued with himself about that for a week, and had come to the conclusion that the argument was a form of parental protectiveness that Eli, at 14, had already earned the right to overrule. The boy was taller now, had the beginning of his adult face. He stood at Marcus's shoulder without fidgeting, watching the horizon. The Veth arrived the same way they always did, light first, then the opening, then the descent. There were 5 of them. The familiar one was there, which Marcus had expected, and 4 others he hadn't encountered before. One of them moved differently from the others, with a kind of circumspection that the Veth didn't usually exhibit, a deliberateness that read, to Marcus's Veth sense, as something very much like the way a person holds themselves when they are about to say something they have not said before. Marcus Cole, said the familiar one. Yes, you have gathered the marked ones, all 17 that we know of. There are more. A pause. 22, currently. We can provide coordinates. Marcus absorbed that. You're offering information. We are beginning the negotiation. The familiar Veth said, in the way your kind negotiates, with an offer. Marcus looked at it for a moment. Looked at the 5 Veths standing in the gray November light on the Scottish coast, their wet slate skin catching the water brightness, their 3 vertical eyes still and steady. He thought about what Adeze had said. They're afraid of us. Uncertain. For the Veth, that might be the same thing. We have an offer too, he said the Veth that moved differently, speaking for the first time. Its voice was better than the others, closer to right, the harmonics less approximate, as if it had practiced more or with more care. We expected that you would. The marked humans keep the modifications. The modifications are ours, not yours. You have no claim on us, on our children, or on what we do with what you've given us. A silence. In exchange, Marcus continued, we don't interfere with your network. We don't attempt to disrupt the other species you've marked. We don't use what we know about your biology and your technology against you. He paused. We're not asking you to stop what you do. We're telling you that what you did to us cannot be undone, and that the undoing of it, the attempt to retrieve what you intended, will cost you more than letting it go. You cannot know what our network contains, said the familiar Veth. No, but you can't know what we'll become. Marcus looked at the 5 of them. That's the trade. Our unpredictability for your certainty. You release the claim, and you get to not find out what 1722 humans, with repurposed Veth modifications, decide to do when they feel cornered. Another silence. The subsonic communication moved between the 5 Veth. Marcus could feel it, and he knew that behind him the others could feel it too. 17 people running their own readings, their own interpretations at Adeze and Tamaz and Park Ji-soo and all the others, each hearing it in the particular way their modification had shaped itself to their humanity. The Veth that moved differently said, you understand that this establishes a precedent. I know. Other species in our network will encounter this record, the record of a species that resisted the intended outcome and negotiated a new one. Good, Marcus said. Let them. A very long silence. The water moved in the Firth. A gull called somewhere to the east. Agreed, said the familiar Veth. It was not dramatic, as endings go. There was no fanfare, no ceremony, no visible change in the world. The Veth simply stood there in the gray light for another moment, and then the light came down around them, and they went up into it, and then they were gone, and the forecourt was just a forecourt on the Scottish coast with 17 humans standing in it, and the smell of salt water and Eli's hand finding Marcus's shoulder. Was that it? Thomas said, from somewhere behind Marcus. That was it, Marcus said. Said Thomas. A pause. I thought it would be bigger. Most things aren't, Adeze said. The important ones are usually very small. Marcus stood there for a moment in the November morning, feeling the 17 signals around him, the music of 17 different human interpretations of the same alien gift. He felt his son's hand on his shoulder. He felt the clean, cold air off the Firth. He felt in the deep altered structure of himself, the Veth residue settling into something that was no longer residue, was no longer borrowed, no longer alien, was his, in the way that everything you carry long enough eventually becomes yours. He thought about a boy throwing a stone at a fence post on a Tuesday evening, and a light coming down, and 3 years of darkness, and a spare room in London, and a bolt suspended in midair, and a field retuned. He thought, we're still here. He thought, we always will be. Behind him, 22 beacons were scattered across the world, 22 people living in the specific human way, each of them carrying something extraordinary, each of them making it their own. In New Zealand, the fault lines were being mapped. In Gdańsk, the cranes were safe. In Lagos, the soil was alive. In Seoul, the mines were healing. And in 100 other places, marked but not owned, altered but not replaced, the ongoing, stubborn, irreducible human experiment was continuing in the particular direction it had always gone. Forward, adapted, unexpected. The Veth had seeded 100 worlds. None of them had been quite like this. Marcus Cole stood on the Scottish coast with his son's hand on his shoulder and looked at the place where the light had been and felt nothing but the wind. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was Tuesday.